Many of you were here for the legal panel, and you want to hear me again? Okay, I'm going to turn around. I'll count to 10. If you want to sneak out, this is your chance, okay? No? All right. You're brave. All right, another question. How many of you think that in the blockchain and crypto space, you're better off just staying outside of the United States? That's almost everybody, and I'm not surprised. So tell me why, guys. Why do you think that? We get a mic out there if we need to. Somebody tell me why would, it's the largest capital market in the world, right? But nevertheless, about 80% of you raised your hand and said, I'm better off just avoiding the US. So why? Regulation. That regulation is worse in the US than everywhere else? Okay. Yes.
My opinion might be a bit different, but it's that U.S. tends to, trailblaze through these things. Kind of, they have the biggest authority to make new regulations and be like the first ones. So you're kind of on shaky ground until there is a firm legal framework.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, I have another question. How many of you think that if you were to issue a crypto coin or a token, whatever you want to call it, I don't care what you call it, but if you were to issue it and the US decided it was a security, that would be the kiss of death for your business? Can you have a token and still have it work and have it treated as security? Yeah? Well, thank you, that helps. So we're just going to take just a few minutes, because I want to talk about kind of the reality versus some of the misconceptions, especially on the US side. A lot of people have heard this concept of what's called the Howey test, or an investment contract, which is what seems to capture so many crypto coins or tokens as securities. And so let me put it in context and try to explain it in simple terms and get rid of some of the ambiguity surrounding it. There's a concept in the US that says, look, if you invest money in a collective enterprise, and you've got an expectation of profits from that investment, and that profit is going to come from the efforts of others, that is what, under US law, we call an investment contract, which is a security. So, we had a lot of examples, especially in 2017 and still in 18, of people that created a token. And one of the famous ones, which the SEC shut down, was this token called MUN. It was by this company called Munchie, and Munchie was going to create this token that people could buy, and then they could use it for a couple things. They could go into a restaurant and they could get discounted meals with the MUN token, and they could also have the right to write a review of the meal. And the MUN token also was intended to prove the identity and prove that the person actually showed up at the restaurant and ate the food, so that it would be a real review, not a fake review that you see on Yelp. And the restaurants, once they had the tokens, could use the tokens to buy advertising, or they could resell them to future customers. And so they were going to create this this ecosystem in which these tokens became part of the restaurant scene. That's a perfectly good, sound business strategy, and certainly those tokens in that context, most people will say, well, it doesn't sound like a security. If anything, it sounds like a substitute for currency, because you're going to use it to buy restaurant meals at a discount, and you're going to use it, the restaurant's going to use it to buy advertising. So why is that a security? So here's what happened. Munchie said, all right, we're going to create this business. It's going to take us about 18 months. But we need money to build the business. We don't have any money. We have to build it. So we're going to sell our tokens today. So today, if you buy our token, what can you do with it? Well, actually, nothing. You had a choice. You could hold the token for 18 months and hope that the management team built their platform like they said they were going to do, and that platform worked and that the token could be used 18 months from now. Or you could find somebody else that hopefully would buy the token from you now for more than you paid for it, because they think that in 18 months the platform's going to be done. So for a year and a half, you could hold this token and speculate, in effect, that there was going to be a business that was going to operate. And on top of that, the team that sold the token said, hey, don't worry, we, the management team, we're going to build this platform. we're only going to sell and make available a certain number of tokens. So the demand for our product, because everybody likes to eat out, everybody likes to go to restaurants, the demand for our token is going to cause its value to go up because it's going to, the supply is going to be limited and everybody's going to want our token. So it's going to increase in value. And the management team said, and by the way, just in case it doesn't, we're going to burn tokens in order to help maintain the value of the token. So the SEC came along and said, so you're creating this token that you're telling us is going to be used as a form of payment to buy restaurant meals at a discount. It's going to be used by restaurants to advertise. But for the next year and a half, all you can do is hold the token. That sounds kind of like a speculative investment, doesn't it? And Munchie, you sold the token to a bunch of people that have no intention of actually ever using it on your platform because you sold it to them at a steep discount, and they bought large quantities of it, and then they immediately tried to resell them in the marketplace. That sounds like a speculative instrument. And you're telling everybody that they have to wait for you to build this platform. So these people have an expectation of profit based upon a future increase in the value of that token based upon your efforts. That sounds like a speculative investment, and that sounds like a security. So it's not actually that complicated. When a lot of people were selling tokens in the ICO craze where there was no business at all, the SEC said, bullshit, those are securities. Now, other jurisdictions I know looked at the future use of the token and said, all right, if 2 years from now when that token actually gets issued, or when the platform gets built and you can start using the token, we agree that in 2 years from now that token may be functioning as a currency or as a utility or as a membership interest or as an access right or something else, and it may make sense that that token is not a security. But that's then and this is now. So it's not actually that complicated. The US says if you want to use a crypto coin or a token as a means of raising capital, it's going to be a security. But if you want to create a cryptocurrency or a token and issue it at the time you've got a functioning business and you're using that token to make that business function, to make that business operate, as a form of payment on your platform, as a way to verify identity on the platform, as a way to get access to the platform. If you're issuing a token for those purposes and not for the purpose of raising capital to build the business, it's not a security. It doesn't have to be a security. So the misconception is that every token in the US has got to be a security and therefore you might as well avoid the US. That's wrong. It's an easy distinction. If you're using the token to raise capital, it's a security. If you're using a token to make your business operate and you haven't used the token to raise the capital to build the business, it's not a security. Second, the SEC even said, look, even if a token starts out as a security because you sold it to raise capital, we recognize that over time, once that platform gets built, once it's up and running, once we've got a decentralized community that really is in charge of maintaining that platform, that token that may have been a security over here is not necessarily a security now. So we also know, number two, notwithstanding the perception, is that the reality is not every token, even if it starts out as a security, has to stay a security. But the third thing and most important thing is everybody assumes that if you issue a token and it has to be treated as security in the US, that that's the kiss of death. And I would argue that it's not for a couple of reasons. One, yes, for the first year, there's a limit on who can buy the token. It has to be what are called in the US accredited investors. It's not a very high standard, but yes, it means that somebody that's a college student probably doesn't qualify. A retiree may not qualify. But people that have at least $250,000 of income in the US would be accredited investor and they can buy the token. So a small piece of the market gets excluded, but not the entire market. And by the way, after 1 year, that restriction goes away, and anybody at that point can rebuy that token. So even if initially it was accredited investor only, after 1 year, a non-accredited investor can rebuy that token. Second assumption is that if it's a security, it's permanently locked up. If you can't trade it, that's not true. There is a lockup for the first year. But in many cases, a lot of tokens are issued, as I said, before the platform is viable. So in many cases, having a token locked up for a year is not that big of a deal. It doesn't kill the business. Next thing, on the non-US side, even if you're selling tokens that are treated as securities and they have to be sold to accredited investors in the US, non-US persons can buy the token whether or not they're accredited investors. So it only applies to the portion of the token sold in the US, not on a worldwide basis. Lastly, and most importantly, if you treat a token as a security and you sell it as an exempt security to accredited investors, you don't have to get SEC approval. People think that you've got to go through a process of registering the token, that the SEC's got to sign off on it, that you're going to spend months negotiating with the SEC. No, not at all. A private placement of an exempt security requires 0 SEC approval when you're selling it to accredited investors in the US. The only thing you have to do is when you sell that token, there is a 2-page information form called a Form D where you say, "Dear SEC, guess what? We sold some tokens. Thank you very much." That's it. So the presumption and perception that the US is closed for business in this space is an unfortunate one because it's wrong. And I would argue 2 things, and then I'll open it to questions. That it's actually not a bad thing to potentially think about issuing tokens as an exempt security, at least initially, because, number one of the biggest problems we've had in this space, and not, of course, anybody in this room, but let's talk about it. One of the biggest problems we've had in this space are a lot of people that cut corners. There were fraudsters out there. There were a lot of people that created tokens where the token was described to do this, but it really did this. And whether or not it's a security or not, for those of us on the investor side, so for a second, put on your investor hat and assume you're all investing. On the investor side, whether it's a security or not, you're entitled to some basic behaviors of commerce that are acceptable and appropriate in the marketplace. As a consumer, as a purchaser of tokens, if people are not providing you real disclosure and they're lying about what they're selling, that should be a problem. If people are telling you they're going to create a token that does X, but it only does Y, that should be a problem. If people don't deliver what they promise, that should be a problem. So there's not a big downside in requiring some basic disclosure and some basic protection of investors by treating a token potentially as an exempt security, again, especially given that you don't need SEC prior approval. And then the second thing that I would leave you with is that, those of us in this space, that are going to conferences like this all the time, get caught up in the hype and we think, wow, this is huge. But on a global basis, blockchain is still like this. The amount of money in blockchain is still like this. And so we know that there are huge amounts of institutional money, private family money, pension money, all still sitting on the sidelines that aren't going to touch this space. And one of the reasons they don't touch this space is because they look at what happened over the last few years and just look at this as a bunch of crazy people, a bunch of fraudsters, a bunch of bullshit that wasn't real and that there was nothing behind it. And if we are willing to act like adults and accept that some regulation is not so bad, then all of a sudden one of the benefits we get is that all of this money sitting on the sidelines starts to look at this space much more seriously. Then the last thing, and then I'll see if people have questions, is that for better or worse, whether you like it or not, as we know, what often happens is that the U.S. Creates all of these rules that people bitch about, but slowly over time, a lot of other jurisdictions around the world start to go the same direction. So more or less where we're going on a global basis, which goes back to why on the earlier panel I said where you're located doesn't matter so much, is that on a global basis, everybody is starting to realize that regardless of whether we call a token a security or not, that issuing tokens require a need to protect investors, to protect consumers, that there should be some type of appropriate disclosure, there should be some type of best practices. On the secondary trading side, things like wash sales and front running and market manipulation are bad regardless of what we call the tokens, and regulators globally are starting to say we've had enough, no more. And so we're getting to the point where whether or not you're in the US or somewhere else, we're going from this kind of immature or Wild West non-regulated mentality to one that's more responsible, more adult-like, where we're going to deal with a world where there's some level of regulation. It's not going to be identical from country to country, but it's going to be comparable from country to country. That's the world we're in, but we can all take advantage of it by going out into the market the right way, embracing that regulatory overstructure, and starting to attract a whole world of investors that aren't yet in the room. Questions?
All right, I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions from the panel, so I'm just opening the floor for questions, okay?
Hi. So I've previously raised funds in the US in the sort of non-crypto way, and now I work in crypto. My question is, you spoke about accredited investors in the US being not such a big barrier, and I'm familiar with what exactly the barrier is. And I also spoke earlier with some of the Liechtenstein lawyers who were helping with aeternity, and they mentioned that there's no basically barrier for a accredited investor in Liechtenstein, and you said the world would basically go where the US is going, which is implying that if the US stays the same and the world's going where it's staying the same in regards to the accredited investor thing, then there'll always be some barrier to entry for people to invest in security tokens. So my question is, do you see potentially the US like lowering this barrier, and if not, why, and if yes, how?
That's a great question. So yes, regulators in the U.S. are talking about a couple of things. One, because as I mentioned, we know that a token that maybe in the view of the SEC starts out as security over time can morph, so it's no longer a security. And so one of the questions is that if you've created a token that is both being used for capital raise, but ultimately intends to have this utility function or this payment function that's going to arise, maybe we should allow all investors to buy it on day one, as opposed to making non-accredited investors wait a year. And so there is some conversation about potentially changing that for tokens, but I think for that to happen ultimately is going to require not only the SEC but congressional action. So we're talking about 3 to 5 years, if at all. So what's more likely going to happen is things that we see are where people bifurcate their capital structure. So whether they do it in tokenized or traditional form, they may issue some capital in the market, treat it as equity, not argue, not hide, say, yes, we're raising, for example, 20 million, we're treating it as equity. People that buy, whether it's tokenized form or traditional form, they're getting an equity stake in the company, and then separately, they're issuing a token that says, and this is our utility that makes our platform, our blockchain run. And so there are various creative ways that we can address the issue now without having to worry about waiting for regulators to change the rules in the US.
Yeah, hi. So at my company, we're building basically a blockchain platform for equity investments into renewable energy. And one of the ways we've found of, I wouldn't say circumventing regulation, but actually adhering to a different form of regulation is through the cooperative legal model. Whereas we're limiting the trading and investments only to the members of the cooperative, which is the owner of the IP of the product itself. So do you have any opinion on this model of investments? We know that it has to have a social benefit aspect to it in order to pass regulatory approvals and everything, but do you have any opinion on this legal model?
Yeah, so there have been a couple of no-action letters that don't directly address that point, but come close. And the argument is that if you're limiting the movement of the tokens to a closed universe like members of cooperative, that the reason the cooperative members are buying that token is because they are a member, and by definition they're buying the token because it's providing some use to them, some reason for them to buy that token other than merely an expectation of profit. So even though the token may go up in value, that doesn't kill it. The SEC looks at that and saying, okay, well, people aren't buying it with an expectation of profit. They're buying it to use. And so a great example is a form of apartment ownership, especially in the East Coast of the United States, which are called co-op apartments. So high-rise apartment building in New York that's called a co-op, you technically don't own your own apartment. You own shares in a cooperative corporation, which give you the right to occupy a certain unit in the building. And even though they're shares in a corporation, the courts have said those aren't treated as securities because you're buying the shares not to simply resell them. You're buying the shares to occupy an apartment in that building. So you're buying it for another purpose, even though you hope your apartment will go up in value when you sell it. So a cooperative situation like that would probably fall in the same bucket.
Hi. So my question is about issuing the security tokens for the accredited investors. If I understood you correctly, you claim that we can issue the security without having a license if we make the prospectus and deliver the whole thing to the US investors.
Correct.
Accredited investors. What are the other limitations? Because let's say in Europe, usually it is that we need to limit amount of people we share that prospectus to. And as far as I know, like no startup or no company who is doing this want to do this thing with U.S. investors. So like they want to, if they want to attract U.S. investor, they want to do it in a different way.
So it's a great question. So a couple things. On the U.S. side, if you have more than 2,000 U.S. holders, it can cause you to become what's called a reporting company. So even though you don't have to register the shares, you may have to do ongoing reporting with the SEC. So most issuers will limit the number of U.S. investors to 1,999 to avoid becoming a reporting company. The second thing is when you're selling securities in tokenized form to both U.S. accredited investors and outside of the U.S. to non-U.S. persons, you need to take efforts, some type of efforts, and typically by building it into the smart contract, white labeling with exchanges, but taking some efforts to make sure that the tokens that were bought by non-U.S. persons aren't resold back into the U.S. So those non-U.S. tokens that are purchased by non-U.S. holders need to be resold outside of the U.S. to other non-U.S. persons. If you take those steps, then basically as an issuer, you are not subject to any security laws. You can market it however you want. Again, the only concern being limiting it to 2,000 U.S. holders, but otherwise you're pretty free to do it. Now on the European side, there's some other issues you have to deal with because they don't have an accredited investor requirement, but there is a concept of a sophisticated investor, and there's a presumption that if it's not registered, there is a clearing party involved in trading those shares. And right now on the European side, we don't have a qualified clearing entity that is geared up to trade digital tokens or securities in tokenized form yet.
Why we need that clearing party? I mean,
It's a European requirement, and so I can tell you that it exists. I'm not a European lawyer. You'd have to ask somebody.
Isn't this already a blockchain which solves that?
The decentralized exchanges or the centralized exchanges that exist to trade crypto to date are not qualified as central clearing counterparties in the EU.
Okay, but is it just a matter of a definition or some additional regulations?
I think it's probably they haven't gotten the appropriate approvals yet.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Joe, for coming on stage for the second time today. Thank you, Joe Telpner.